At 15 years old, Vladimir Putin walked into a KGB office and asked for a job. They told him to come back after university. Most teenagers would have forgotten about it by the next week. He spent the next 6 years preparing for a career in an organisation that didn't accept applications, didn't advertise, and didn't owe anyone an explanation. That's the KGB in one story. You didn't choose them. They chose you. And if you wanted in badly enough, you learned to wait until they decided you were worth using. Level 1, the informant. Before you become an officer, before you ever touch a classified file or sit across from a foreign target in a hotel bar, the Soviet system trains you in a simpler role. You listen, you watch, you report. Maybe you're a student asked to keep an eye on classmates. Maybe you work in a factory and quietly mention which co-worker drinks too much, complains too often, or listens to foreign radio. Maybe you live in an apartment block and file little reports about your neighbours for ideological reasons, fear, ambition, or because someone in authority suggested cooperation would be remembered favourably. This is the bottom rung of the KGB ecosystem. Not glamorous, not powerful, but essential. The KGB recruited informants by the thousands because a surveillance state runs on volume. Tiny acts of betrayal, tiny acts of obedience, tiny files that grow into leverage later. Most informants never rise beyond that. They are useful, disposable, and easy to replace. But if someone notices something in you, discipline, languages, connections, emotional coldness, the ability to report on people without flinching, you may get pulled towards something higher. And higher inside the KGB doesn't just mean better pay or more prestige. It means proximity to the real machinery of Soviet power. Level 2, the recruit. The KGB does not want dreamers. It wants usable people. That's why recruitment is quiet. No application forms, no public exams, no announcement that you've been selected for the elite. If you're lucky enough or dangerous enough to fit the profile, a stranger approaches you at the right moment in your life and starts a conversation that sounds casual until you realize it isn't. Maybe you're finishing at the Moscow State Institute of International Relations, where future diplomats and foreign ministry officials are trained. Maybe you studied law, like Putin. Maybe you speak German or English well enough to be useful abroad. Maybe your family background is politically clean and your instincts are ideologically safe. The KGB is not looking for the brightest person in the room. Bright people can become difficult. They're looking for a more dangerous combination. Intelligence without independence. Ambition without conscience. Competence without moral friction. Smart enough to operate in complex environments. Obedient enough not to question why. Once you're in the recruitment process, the testing never really stops. Officially, you may be preparing for state service. Unofficially, you're being measured for malleability. Can you follow orders without needing the whole picture? Can you protect the institution before you protect yourself? Can you learn to speak the language of power without ever pretending it belongs to you? If the answer is yes, you move into training. If the answer is no, the conversation ends, and nobody explains why. Level 3, the young officer. If you make it into the KGB as an officer, your life narrows fast. The elite path runs through the Felix Dzerzhinsky Higher School in Moscow, where future officers study foreign languages, tradecraft, operational psychology, surveillance detection, recruitment techniques, and political reliability. But not everyone gets that version. Many young officers are trained on the job with internal manuals, senior mentors, and constant evaluation. A document called A Plan for the Individual Training of a Young Officer of the State Security Service lays out the essentials: recruiting and handling agents, maintaining cover, writing reports, detecting surveillance, staying politically reliable. That last part matters as much as anything else. In the KGB, competence without loyalty is a liability, and loyalty is never assumed. Your colleagues are watching you. Your reports are being read for more than content. Your tone matters. Your conclusions matter. Your ideological posture matters. The KGB is training you to gather secrets, yes, but it is also training you to survive a bureaucracy that punishes the wrong thought almost as fast as the wrong failure. Some young officers begin in dull, grinding assignments, watching foreign diplomats in Leningrad, tracking suspicious movement, logging patterns, following targets through rain, crowds, train stations, safe houses. It isn't glamorous, but it teaches the first law of the system. Details are power, and power belongs to the institution first. You are not a James Bond figure here. You are a cog learning how the machine rewards silence, precision, and obedience. Level 4. The case officer. If you perform well and cultivate the right mentors, you may get sent abroad. That's when the job changes. Now you operate under diplomatic cover in places like Vienna, Berlin, Washington. To outsiders, you are a cultural attaché, trade official, embassy staffer, or bureaucrat with good suits and forgettable manners. In reality, you are running assets, identifying weaknesses, recruiting spies, stealing secrets, and building networks that can survive even if Moscow never acknowledges they exist. This is where the KGB becomes what the West feared most. A typical case officer handles a small stable of agents at a time. 4 or 5, not dozens. Quality matters more than volume. Each one requires careful cultivation, secure communications, emotional management, and constant assessment. Is he still loyal? Is she wavering? Is someone drinking too much? Is financial pressure creating opportunity or instability? The KGB studies pressure points with clinical patients: money, ideology, ego, resentment, desire, fear. If they have compromising material, they call it kompromat. Evidence of an affair, financial misconduct, something illegal, something humiliating. The point is not always to expose it. Often the point is letting the target imagine exposure and then decide cooperation is the least painful option. When blackmail isn't necessary, greed often works just as well. John Anthony Walker, a US Navy Chief Warrant Officer, walked into the Soviet embassy in 1967 and offered to sell secrets for cash. No ideology, no coercion, just greed. Over the next 18 years, he gave the Soviets access to a staggering amount of American naval communications. One man's financial appetite opened a window into US strategy. That's what a successful KGB case officer understands better than almost anyone else. The world does not run on patriotism nearly as often as people pretend. It runs on weakness, and weakness always has a price. Level 5. The operator. Now the climb becomes less about fieldcraft alone and more about politics inside the institution. This is where many careers stall. Because success in the KGB is never just operational. Yes, results matter. If you run productive agents, deliver valuable reporting, or pull off a significant penetration, people notice. But they also notice who you're aligned with, whose conclusions you support, which faction you strengthen, and whether your reporting flatters the worldview of the men above you. Truth is useful. Career survival is mandatory. A report that tells Moscow what it wants to hear can do more for your future than a truthful report that embarrasses the wrong superior. That is how intelligence services drift into self-deception, and the KGB was not immune. It was built for control, which meant people learned quickly how to shape information upward. Oleg Kalugin learned that operational brilliance could take you far and then disappear overnight. He became the youngest general in KGB history after successful work in Washington. A few years later, he criticized the wrong person and got shoved downward. That's the ladder in its purest form. Achievement gets you noticed, but survival depends on knowing who is allowed to feel threatened by it. The KGB's directorates each offer different versions of this climb. First Chief Directorate handles foreign intelligence. Second Chief Directorate controls counterintelligence and internal security. Third watches the military. Fifth crushes ideological dissent. Seventh conducts surveillance. Eighth handles communications and cryptology. Each directorate has its own culture, its own promotion logic, its own traps. And each one is a world where competence alone is not enough. If you want real power, you must learn the central lesson of every secret police bureaucracy. Do your job well, but never so independently that the institution starts asking whether you still belong to it. Level 6. The General. By the time you reach the senior ranks, you are no longer just running operations. You are shaping the internal priorities of the state. Colonel is often where institutional leadership begins. General is where the walls fall away and the real nature of the KGB becomes visible. At this level, you're not just handling spies or approving surveillance files. You're helping decide which dissent movements get crushed, which foreign operations get funded, which political realities are allowed to exist. This is the point where the KGB stops looking like an intelligence service and starts revealing itself as a parallel government. Sergei Kondrashev understood the game well enough to survive Stalin's purges, navigate foreign intelligence, and eventually run active measures. The disinformation campaigns designed to manipulate Western opinion and policy. He wasn't just gathering secrets, he was helping manufacture reality at scale. Viktor Cherkashin showed what happens when operational success and institutional timing align. In the mid-1980s, he wound up handling both Aldrich Ames and Robert Hanssen, two of the most devastating American traitors of the Cold War. Between them, they compromised huge parts of US intelligence and counterintelligence. That kind of success doesn't just earn praise. It buys influence, but even here, nobody is safe. A general can rise fast and still be destroyed if he aligns with the wrong patron or becomes useful to the wrong side in an internal struggle. KGB careers are built on secrecy, but also on fear. Not the fear of enemies only. The fear of rivals, superiors, factions, and the knowledge that the institution which promoted you can erase you just as quickly. By this stage, you are not simply a Soviet officer, you are part of the ruling architecture. Level 7. The spymaster. At the top of the ladder sits the chairman of the KGB. This is not the head of a normal intelligence agency. It is one of the most powerful positions in the Soviet Union. The chairman does not merely oversee espionage. He sits near the center of political power itself. He influences foreign policy. He shapes domestic repression. He decides how the state responds to dissidents, defectors, ideological drift, unrest, and enemies both real and imagined. The KGB is not subordinate in any ordinary sense. It is one of the main instruments through which the Soviet system understands and defends itself. Yuri Andropov proved how far this power could extend. After running the KGB and using it to crush dissent and strengthen state control, he became General Secretary of the Soviet Union. That is the end point of the ladder. The secret police stops serving power and becomes power. And yet, even here, the machine remains dangerous. Alexander Shelepin helped orchestrate Khrushchev's removal and briefly looked like a man who could turn security power into permanent political dominance. Brezhnev used him, then cut him down and stripped away his influence. That's the final irony of this world. At the highest level, the KGB is powerful enough to shape history and fragile enough to devour its own leaders the moment they become inconvenient. Then, the Soviet Union collapses. December 1991. The KGB officially ceases to exist on paper. In reality, the methods survive, the personnel survive, the institutional habits survive, the FSB inherits domestic security, the SVR inherits foreign intelligence. The manuals remain classified because they are still useful. The training logic remains intact because the state still needs the same kind of men. And then there is Putin. At 15, he asked for the job. Years later, he got it. His KGB career looked ordinary by elite standards. Law degree, recruitment, training, domestic work, East Germany, lieutenant colonel. Nothing about it screamed future ruler. And then the Soviet state collapsed. The system rebranded, and one former KGB man moved from the successor service into the presidency of Russia. There is no such thing as a former KGB man. Putin said that himself. That line explains the whole ladder better than any memoir ever could. The informant who reported on neighbours climbed one rung. The officer who recruited foreign spies climbed another. The bureaucratic survivor who learned how to flatter, manipulate, and endure climbed higher still, but every rung led toward the same destination: power that outlived the Soviet Union itself. The flag changed. The acronym changed. The system did not. Because the KGB was never just an institution. It was a method for producing men who could surveil, recruit, manipulate, repress, and wait. And in Russia, those men are still running the game.